an American legend. I'm Tegan Kehoe from the Paul Revere House, and as you may know, this panel is part of our Lowell lecture series titled Whose Midnight Ride? Reflections on the 250th anniversary of the famous ride. When we started planning this year's series, I wanted to put together a panel on the relevance of the Midnight Ride today, and I had informally been calling this the Who Cares panel. And I meant that both tongue-in-cheek and seriously, as in, who is it who cares about this? What do they have in common or not have in common? And I mentioned at a staff meeting I was going to need to come up with a real title, and colleagues set me straight and said that the working title needed to stay. So this is the Who Cares About the Midnight Ride panel. I do want to let you know we have one more lecture in this series, or panel rather. Next week, same time, same place, we will have two biographers of Paul Revere in discussion with the Paul Revere House's executive director. So that'll be another don't miss it. And we also, in November, we have a revolutionary concert with an engaging and immersive musical program, and that will be at Converse Hall on Tremont Street in Boston, and that's also free. So feel free to check out our website for more about that. We've also got little flyerlets about that in the front there. I want to thank our program partners for this series, starting with our host, Suffolk University, and specifically the History Department, and our live stream and recording partners, GBH. Our other partners are Old North Illuminated, Lexington History Museums, Evanston History Center at the Charles Gates Dawes House in Evanston, Illinois, and Made by Us. This series is made possible by funding from the Lowell Institute. After the presentation, we'll have time for some questions. I'll pass a microphone around, and I'll also read aloud questions that have come in from the live stream. I'm delighted to introduce our moderator and panelists for this evening. Dr. Noelle Trent, as many of you may know, is the president and CEO of Museum of African American History here in Boston. And our panelists are in a different order in person than they are on my sheet. I will just not read. So Kerry Dunne is a History and Social Studies Department head at Lexington High School. Ahsante Bean is a content creator and storytelling strategist. And Eileen Ka-May Cheng is history faculty at Sarah Lawrence College. Thank you all so much for being here. And thank you all, and please join me in welcoming our moderator and panelists.
Well, thank you. Good evening, everyone. Oh, thank you. Okay, guys, if you're going to be really stoic, this is not going to be a fun situation for anybody. So let me try it again. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
And good evening to those of you on live stream. I hope you said it twice. Who cares about the Midnight Ride? Perspectives on an American legend. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere on the 18th of April in 75. Hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. Record scratch. Well, Mr. Longfellow, you're right about one thing. No one is alive who remembers that day and year. However, together, 250 years later, we wonder who cares about the Midnight Ride. Our panelists today come to this story with varying perspectives, all of which encourage us to think differently about that moment. So from the title of this panel and from Tegan's introduction, you can see that there's a healthy nature of tongue-in-cheek, glib, sarcasm, whatever you would call it, associated in this title, Who Cares? So let's start there. Who do you actually think cares today and why? Any of you, don't make me call somebody out.
I'm happy to start. I think a lot of people care. We had over 100,000 people visit Lexington and Concord April 18th, April 19th, April 20th of 2025 to commemorate the 250th anniversary of those historic battles, or the historic battle and the events leading up to it. It was just an invigorating and very, very interesting time. People who just love history, people who are motivated by themes of that time period that we still care about today: freedom, self-determination, having a voice in one's government. It still resonated, and people came from all over the country and even the world to remember that. It was motivating.
So Ahsante, same question.
To echo that, I think folks who care about the themes and what we stand for as a country, what our identity really is as a country, working through that today, being an online content creator, those are a lot of the conversations that I see online that are relevant to it.
I have a little of a different perspective. I can only speak to the audience that I know best, which is college students. And what I see is most of them know who Paul Revere was in a very general sense. They know the idea of the Midnight Ride. But there's a lot of variability over how much they really care. I think the students I have who are from the Massachusetts area, it is something they were raised with, something they're very familiar with, and I think he is a vivid, and the ride is a vivid part of their historical consciousness. But for my other students, it's something sort of vague, and I'm not sure how deeply they care in the sense of having some kind of emotional connection to it. So I don't know how much is a regional difference and how much there's generational differences involved.
Well, let's stay with that theme. And Eileen, both you and Kerry I'm sorry, Dr. Dunne and Dr. Cheng.
Kerry is fine.
I try to do formal the first time, and then we get real comfortable after that. Both of you teach at different academic levels, and so looking at your students, are they familiar with Paul Revere? Do they even know the Longfellow poem, which is, for those of us in the public history field, we just take it for granted that if people know about Paul Revere, that's the way they know about him. But that's not necessarily how people were introduced. For all we know, they saw one of the Disney 1960s cartoons or the Ben Franklin Mouse cartoon, and that's how they met Paul Revere. Nevertheless, do they know who he is, and what is the reaction to this history?
Well, I'm currently teaching the Intro to Law class at Lexington High School, and it's an elective open to grades 9 through 12. Anyone can take it, no prerequisite. So it's a pretty good sample of our student population. So today I told them I was going to be at this event, and told them that the question was, who still cares about Paul Revere? And I asked them if they had learned about Paul Revere, if they knew who he was, where they had learned about him and how, and if they knew the poem. So I have 4 students who had actually just arrived this year to Lexington High School from other countries who had not heard of Paul Revere, but were really interested in finding out more, right? Everyone else had at least heard of Paul Revere. Some had done a pretty extensive lesson about Paul Revere and the Midnight Ride in either 5th grade or 8th grade, and could remember the specifics of it. And as for the poem, I memorized the poem. We had to memorize the poem in 3rd grade at Juniper Hill Elementary School in Framingham. None of them had memorized the poem. About 5 of them knew the poem and actually maybe knew even some of the inaccuracies in the poem, either because they had had a teacher who had presented it as one historical account of Paul Revere's ride to compare with other accounts, or because a parent had shared the poem with them at home.
Okay. Eileen?
Well, I mean, basing it on, I just taught on Paul Revere a few weeks ago in my American Revolution class. I would say my student from Massachusetts knew a lot about Paul Revere, knew the poem, but everyone else, all they knew was sort of a vague sense of, oh, Midnight Ride, lone figure, and they didn't really know much else. And I think between them, there were some who had a vague sense of the poem, and I think others who were really not familiar with the poem at all.
Yeah, and so we think the familiarity, what people know, is both based in myth and reality, right? And so there's a lot of different aspects to this history, in terms of Boston being a hotbed of spying activity that Paul Revere was kind of involved in. Yes, in the words of Nicole Hill, our ancestors were messy. They're not as neat and sanctified as we want them to, as we would like to think they are. Ahsante, with your work, you look at the role of myths and their role in society. How do you approach a retelling of a story like The Midnight Ride so it feels relevant to modern audiences? And by the way, I do love your YouTube channel. Bean Thinking is fabulous. If you have not had an opportunity to check it out, it is wonderful. Great commentary there.
Thank you very much. Well, my audience is interested primarily in how we can change political and economic systems so that they better serve and reflect ordinary Americans. And so that's the kind of framing that I lean into when I talk about political and economic history. And so with the Midnight Ride, I think it's a good example of what effective political action looks like. And if we dismantle the myths, we can get a better idea of what the reality of political action looks like. So with Paul Revere, it kind of leans into the individual hero myth of political action, where in the stories, Paul Revere is following his own initiative and takes it upon himself to alert people to what's going on. But in the reality, he was part of these larger organizations, larger networks, like you were saying. He was commissioned to do several rides by the Boston Committee of Correspondence, which was essentially a self-organized, self-funded resistance community network, right? And so knowing that larger context, also knowing about the Sons of Liberty, the secret intelligence organization that this was a part of. And so knowing that Paul Revere himself within the Sons of Liberty wasn't a leader himself, he was a really good messenger, but he did the ride at the behest of one of the local leaders, Dr. Joseph Warren. So understanding that he wasn't just taking this upon himself, but he was part of this larger trusted network of people spreading information, helps folks to realize that yes, you as an individual might have very solid skills, just like Paul Revere did, but being connected to those wider networks of support will make your impact much more visible and much more felt. And that's how I would try to frame that and make that relevant to a modern audience.
Yeah, do you find people want those myths to be reinforced, or are they eager to find myths dismantled and reimagined?
Well, I feel like people mostly want explanations as to why the systems that they feel like should work are not working for them. And so if you're going to dismantle a myth about how these systems work, you need to give them a new one that addresses their grievances. So if you have a myth that is serving folks, they might lean into that if they feel like it actually addresses what's making them upset with the current moment, right? We have grievance-driven politics, and there were grievance-driven politics back during the revolutionary times too, right? Like the Declaration of Independence was largely a list of grievances.
Yeah, there were a few complaints in there.
Yeah,
there's just a few complaints in there.
So whatever story, myth is going to speak to those grievances, that's the one that's going to have the most narrative power. So if you're deconstructing and you don't want people to just sink into nihilism and despair about, well, wait, what story is actually going to get us out of this if this one isn't true, you need to make sure that you're replacing that with something that is true, that is based in the facts, and that's what people are really eager for, is that sort of explanation.
Thank you. And I think if we keep with that thread of the how the myths are serving people, you know, for quite a while, the Paul Revere's Midnight Ride, especially the reimagining, the inaccurate reimagining with Longfellow. He was a poet. He took some liberties. We'll forgive him. He kind of did a couple other important things. The reality we know is more complex. So how do we balance a captivating story with historical accuracy and reality, both in your work as well as within the classroom? Eileen, you want to take a stab?
Well, I mean, I don't have a solution to that, but I think it's possible. I mean, the book that I use to teach about Paul Revere's Ride, a book by David Hackett Fisher, which probably a lot of you know, I think does a great job of that. I mean, his aim is to take apart the myth of the lone midnight rider, and he's one of the people who has shown that it was this collective network. But it's a very engaging, dramatic story, and it's actually more interesting and more engaging when you see how many moving parts it took for the ride to have the impact that it did. And it's also a very deeply researched book, so I think it can be done, but I mean, I think it is a challenge that I think all historians face.
This is a great example of, I think actually myth busting is really quite popular right now, but this is not a case where when you learn more, you're busting the myths so much as learning that it was a much more complex individual and many individuals and networks broad throughout the colonies, the committees of correspondence to like local channels of communication that were extremely fast and efficient, even without any sort of modern communication technology that we have today. So I see it more as when you look at the inaccuracies of the poem, it's a springboard for learning more about what actually happened, learn more about the other individuals involved, learning more about this historical era and some of the dynamics that existed. And it becomes only more interesting. as you learn.
Yeah, and I have to say that moving here to Boston, I thought I knew a lot about Paul Revere. Found out very quickly I was wrong on a lot of things. But one of the things I discovered was in a 1798 letter, Paul Revere recounted having to change course near a site where Mark, one of 3 enslaved men, had been hanged for the murder of his owner. And for me, seeing that letter and learning that story highlights that the story of the Midnight Ride unfolded on a landscape that's shaped by racial violence and trauma. And that's not a theme that we associate with the Midnight Ride. Now, it's not saying that Paul Revere was involved in that, but it would be the equivalent if you were in Minneapolis and you walked by the space that George Floyd was tragically killed, and you're trying to orient yourself to your reader is, well, this is where I'm at. And so the fact that this is laid on top of this trauma, this is not part of the revolutionary narrative of Boston or New England or the narrative writ large that's communicated out. And so this is overlooked in these traditional narratives. So how should we integrate these realities into the way we teach, interpret, or retell the story today?
I think about how these different struggles are struggles for liberation in these different ways. And so there's the revolutionary struggle that's about, taxation without representation and the political side of that. And then there's also the struggle against slavery and against, ownership of human beings and self-ownership, right? So they're both kind of struggles around rights, self-ownership, the extent of property, right, and what we consider to be property. And so, of course, there are different struggles, as you said, but you can weave together this narrative of how we as Americans have been continuously fighting for more and more freedom and rights over time, and integrate the stories that way.
I'll confess, I did not know about the story of Mark, the enslaved person who had essentially been lynched. And this was noted in a kind of a matter-of-fact manner by Paul Revere until I was preparing for this session, and it was something I needed to learn, but it was hard to hear that history and learn that history. For a long time, teaching the Revolutionary War, I and many other teachers have made sure we've really elevated the experience of African Americans in participation in the war. The 10% of troops number still holds pretty consistently, and there are really phenomenal individual stories throughout this area. Prince Estabrook of Lexington is really well remembered in Lexington. I live in Framingham. Peter Salem's contributions are very well remembered in Framingham, right? And so we've been doing that for a long time, as we should. But perhaps this history of Mark and people who suffered really terrible fates, and the terrible reality that this was a time period when most Black people living in the British colonies were still enslaved, right? It's something that we have to keep as part of the context as well of learning this history. So.
Well, I think also just to piggyback on these two comments, I think one of the things that's interesting about the David Hackett Fisher book I mentioned is he doesn't really talk about race and slavery, but there's a couple of throwaway references to enslaved people who pick up the message that the British are coming and they take it to other people. And so it's always interested me that they would do that. And Fisher doesn't explain it, but I think what that shows is that these people were not just passive victims of oppression, that they were trying to find some way to claim agency despite their oppression, and that they were active participants in the ride as well. And so I think bringing more attention to people like that could help integrate their stories into the ride.
So Eileen, I want to stick with you for a moment. There's been a lot of evolution in how the Midnight Ride's narrative has been told, and you've referenced the book quite a bit in our discussion. What does the evolution of this narrative tell us about the changing ideas of patriotism and our national identity? And I say that knowing that that is in flux at this moment, and we don't quite know where we're going to land. I mean, technically, we're already in our 250th moment because we're Massachusetts. You're welcome, America. We helped you do it. But for the rest of the country, they're going to acknowledge it next year. they're a little behind. But in this moment where we're feeling like there's a contentious American identity, what does that tell us about these changing ideas of patriotism and our national collective identity?
Well, I think it's interesting that the whole story of the Midnight Ride, or the mythic view, came out also at a time when national identity was in flux and in a very contentious state. That, the Longfellow poem, which is what established the myth, came out on the day that South Carolina seceded. So it's right on the eve of the Civil War, at a time when I think Americans were feeling very insecure about whether or not their national identity was strong enough to keep the nation together. And yet the poem actually promotes a very strident, very celebratory nationalism. I think that's a repeated pattern that you see in our history, where the most strident, celebratory expressions of our nationalism often come not from a place of confidence, but from a place of insecurity, at times of flux and uncertainty. And I think you can see some of that today, even with some of the rhetoric of nationalism that's being propounded.
Absolutely. Kerry, I want you to use your imagination here. If you could redesign how the Midnight Ride is taught or interpreted nationwide, what would you change to make it more inclusive and relevant?
Well, first of all, I'd make sure it's actually being taught, and more broadly that history is being taught. And I'll be the angry history teacher right now. When I was growing up, I had an hour of history every day from through elementary school, middle school, and high school. And that's been unfortunately chipped away at. I mean, it really has its roots in like late 90s, early 2000s, No Child Left Behind, high stakes testing that only happens in ELA and mathematics, science and history being pushed to the side. Now, really, the best case scenario in many elementary schools is that kids have, maybe a month of history, and then they have a month of science, and they flip-flop back and forth, but they almost never get both at the same time. So I would say, first thing I do is make sure that all of our kids are getting history every year and done well with an appropriate amount of time devoted to it. I think we've got great teachers throughout this country, really wonderful, passionate, intelligent students, and if they're given the opportunities to learn, they will run with it, and they will learn a lot and really know so much about our country and its complex past in our world. So that's the biggest thing I would do. But other than that, redesigning how we learn about it. I loved hearing from one of my students today about how her 8th grade teacher had kids look at varying accounts of Paul Revere's Ride, including Longfellow's poem, but others as well, primary sources and secondary sources looking back, right? And kind of corroborate the sources, find the truth by doing so, see what questions were raised, and essentially kind of tell their own story as a result of that. I think that's a great way to learn, and I think that students of all ages can do that. So that's the sort of model of instruction. And I also will put a plug in here for place-based learning, right?
Please, we love that.
Right, if the students have not walked the Freedom Trail, if they have not visited the Paul Revere House, if they haven't been to the Old North Bridge in Concord, they need to go to these places, and we really need to be making sure that is still happening in all of our schools.
Well, we need to keep plugging that they need to visit the Paul Revere House.
Sure
right,
thing.
Nina?
All right.
Yeah. She's my colleague. I got to make sure I say that, otherwise I don't get invited back if I don't get to hang out. Ahsante, similar question. What would you like to see be taught or interpreted differently in like an influencer style or in media? Like, how do you see that? What could change to make it more inclusive and more relevant?
I think more understanding, and Paul Revere's Midnight Ride speaks to this, of what goes into political organizing and how effective political change happens. When we can make the history relevant through what are the lessons that are being learned, what are the strategies, what are the tactics that folks in the past who had challenges with the government and, again, grievances, things that they wanted addressed that weren't being addressed by their current systems, how did they maneuver, and what lessons can we learn from that, so that that can be a bit more engaging to folks and simply, learning the facts as if the past is in the past, seeing those echoes in the same sorts of conflicts and discussions that we're having today makes things much more relevant, I think, for an online audience.
Eileen, what would you like to see changed in collegiate classrooms, or are we doing enough? Maybe we got it perfect and there's nothing that needs to change in terms of the teaching of the Midnight Ride.
I don't know about what's going on in collegiate classrooms, but I think generally speaking, I think what would be good is to have more sense of Paul Revere in conjunction with the other side. I think another problem with the Longfellow myth is that it glorifies the Patriots and portrays the British as just this evil, tyrannical force. And I think what's important to understand is that that the people who opposed the revolution, both the British and the loyalists who supported the British, were not necessarily these evil tyrants. I mean, it's interesting, when the British captured Revere, they let him go because they believed in rule of law. So to understand that it's not a conflict between evil tyrants and brave patriots, but that they're two cultures with different ideas of what liberty is.
I love that. That's a really great way to think about that. And as we think through, I'm going a little rogue here before we get to the last set of questions. As we think about that, there's also you all had mentioned it, there's this rugged individualism narrative that has come up with Paul Revere versus the collective action. So what do we need to do to help push back against this rugged individualism? Looking at when that sort of nature came out, that was in a very specific time in the 19th century when you have like this self-made man sort of mentality. Horatio Alger novels are very popular at the time. So Paul Revere becomes this mechanism to deliver this idea of ideal American manhood and things like that versus the reality of a collective action and a community organizing and resistance. What do we need to change about our approach to lean more away from the individualism and to the collective action?
I think part of it is having stories with some complexity to them. One element is that it's very easy to talk about an individual story, straightforward, one main character, right? But explaining how the networks operated, explaining how communication channels work, takes more time, it takes more space, takes more words. It's just a more complex thing. Attention spans need to be a little longer, perhaps, for that. But if we get into the mode of teaching in that way and explaining in that way and taking the time, I do like that YouTube videos have gotten sort of longer and longer as a norm, right? Then that's, I think, part of getting beyond the very simple one-character narratives.
Either of you?
I mean, I think I agree that I think, too much of the way I think people learn about history is through sort of celebrating individual figures. Even when we think about the revolution, still people think of, these people we call the founding fathers. And instead to kind of understand the revolution was created by a lot of different people and to look at somehow, it's hard. I mean, because, as you were saying, it's easier to look at an individual. It's more interesting, it's more dramatic. But somehow to show that looking at a group can be just as interesting and dramatic as looking at an individual, I think would be an important step.
Complete agreement, right? Not just the individual, but look at the society, right? Look at the common man, look at the common woman. How are they involved, right? What did that figure represent at that time? Who else was doing similar efforts? That's a great question to ask regarding Paul Revere. I mean, there were literally other riders here, right? There were similar rides that took place in other colonies, right, to spread alarms, right, that were very parallel to Paul Revere's ride. And just the house-to-house network communication was amazing at that time. And that's maybe even more impressive than the solitary lone rider.
For those in the audience and those on live stream, can you talk a little bit more about the house-to-house network? We've referenced it a couple of times. What makes that so efficient? How did that work? How did that function?
Well, trust was built over, a decade with the Sons of Liberty, right? So these are people who knew their neighbors. Like Paul Revere knew to skip certain houses because they were loyalists, right? So he wasn't crying out the
his route.
Yes, and knew which places to avoid. So it takes a lot of community building, trust building, network building. So that's a big part of it.
What else about the house network that made it so efficient? Are we talking that are we surprised because it took them hours? I mean, today we all have our cell phones, so we can get stuff fairly instantaneously. I mean, sometimes it lags a few seconds, but what's the efficiency that impresses you so much about those networks?
Well, they weren't just spreading the word, which they absolutely were spreading the word, but they were also starting to prepare. I mean, at the Buckman Tavern, you had the woman innkeeper like start frantically cooking because she knew people were going to be showing up there and needed to eat, you know. And I think you saw that replicated along the route as well.
Okay. So let's look at this 21st century moment as we're reflecting on the Midnight Ride and the upcoming 250th. What are you hearing from your audiences? What excites people? What intrigues people? What frustrates them about this, I'm going to say, commemorative moment? Because in quite a few discussions, a lot of people have said this isn't celebratory for everybody. So a lot more folks are leaning into this commemorative moment. But in this moment, how are people reacting? What are they thinking?
For me, I think about the discussions around American identity and what we stand for, and those things that, again, the Midnight Ride and later the Declaration of Independence were about, haven't been fully realized yet for a lot of folks. And so thinking in this moment, 250 years later, what kind of political organizing, sort of political revolutionary work we still have yet to do to try to realize those ideals, particularly political equality, that were expressed in the Declaration, and what lessons can we learn from that original political uprising?
I think it's a chance for us to kind of check in and take pulse as a nation, right? We've made it 250 years. That's really exciting. It's a long time, and our founding documents are still intact with, you know, shockingly few amendments even to our Constitution. But where have we realized the ideals of the founders, and where have we not, and where do we still have work to do is I think the question I would ask.
Yeah, I think because there's an awareness amongst my students of how much more work there is to be done, and because this is such a contentious time, I think they're a bit frustrated by the traditional glorification of the revolution, of you know, things like the Midnight Ride, and I think they want to break away from that. So I think they'd like to see, I think, a 250th where there is more of that complexity that we're talking about.
So what are your students saying when they're expressing their frustrations?
I'm trying to think. I mean, I think that they're sort of puzzled, you know, by the glorification. I think they are maybe a little more jaded than I was at their age about the myths that we have. So I think that's why stories like Paul Revere maybe don't have as much power for some of them as they once did.
Okay. So on Saturday, thousands of people gathered basically right around here for the No Kings protest, as you may have seen on the news, evoking the spirit of Boston's revolutionary era. And as we reflect on Paul Revere's ride, what are the broader lessons that we should take away and what we should carry forward?
I think one interesting one, because we've talked about individualism versus collective action, that's one. I think another one, which is interesting to think about broader political protest movements, is how clandestine Paul Revere's ride was and how this was a secret, and they had to be very stealthy about their organizing. So yes, there are the big, loud political, there goes my water bottle. There are the big, loud political protest moments, but there's also a place for behind the scenes network building, strategically maneuvering, understanding where your political opposition might be operating and how to move accordingly, that is discussed, you know, less publicly as a strategy.
Or I think related to that, I mean, I think one of the things that's so misleading about the mythic view of the Midnight Ride is that it makes it seem like resistance is easy, that, you know, one man can come in and save the day and wake up people who are slumbering to oppression, and they can just all rise up and overthrow the British. When in reality, as I think Ahsante, you were alluding to, you know, there was a lot of planning and organizing, that it takes work and preparation. And I think that people have to recognize that, and it takes patience, that it isn't going to happen in the blink of an eye.
Yeah, I think that's the hardest lesson for folks today, is that we're such an instantaneous society, that the idea that change can take time and a lot of, you gotta negotiate and swallow some things and stand in front of some opposition before you really see the fruits of the labor that you're looking for. So let's talk about what the Midnight Ride is about: warning, urgency, collective action. What rides today, if you will, if we're going to stick with that, should we be paying attention to in our time? What are the calls to action that you hear people discussing today?
I was trying to think of who were the modern parallels to kind of the Paul Revere's ride.
Yeah.
And I really landed on, public figures and everyday citizens who are willing to talk directly to the people and not in a condescending manner either, right? And I was trying to think of people who do that today, right? Certainly, I thought of Heather Cox Richardson, right? The late Bell Hooks, the late James Lowen, who really, all of them academics, right? But they also oriented at least a part of their discourse towards the common person in a non-paywalled open access format, which I think is very, very important. We still have lots of people today who will jump in and support any investigation or learning about history. Professor Bob Allison from Suffolk, who's in the back of the room, has answered my call many times, asking him to talk to my students, answer a question. I've sent reporters on to him. He's always giving of his time. There's another retired history professor, Bob Bellinger from Suffolk, who does the same thing, right? And I think it's that communication, help other people to learn, right? Spread the word, right? And further them on their own journeys is what we take away. Definitely some of the tech stuff is exciting too. I loved watching the Bean Thinking YouTube channel videos. So thank you, Ahsante. Those were really exciting. But that is similarly spreading the word and asking big questions and getting others talking in a format that's maybe particularly appealing to younger people, right, as well. So that's a ride, in quotes, today as well, right? In Lexington, we had a really amazing effort by the Association of Black Citizens of Lexington to put together 9 videos that are now on YouTube that highlight the contributions of 9 different Black citizens of Lexington during the Revolutionary era, some of whom actually fought in the revolution, and others had other roles, right, during that era. But they're really interesting. They're not paywalled. Anyone can watch them. They're bringing learning, knowledge, and access to everyone. And to me, that's the ride we should be engaging in right now.
Eileen?
I mean, I don't know what ride we should be engaging in, but what I would say is I think what we need, I think this relates to your point, Kerry, that what made Paul Revere so effective was he was able to bridge different constituencies. That I think, as Fisher's book points out, he was one of two of Boston's revolutionary leaders who belonged to all of the major resistance networks in the Boston area. And so he was able to kind of work with elites, with ordinary people. And so I think we need more people in our world who are able to bridge those different constituencies instead of only speaking to specific segments of society.
Or people who are just like you, to be able to speak to people who are different than you and go into other communities and find out the commonalities that you share. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think similarly, since we have modern communication networks that can transmit messages really quickly, all of us have some potential to be writers, community connectors within our own communities. And the great thing that Paul Revere did beforehand was build that trust with people, build the ability to send a message in and be trusted. So if we can be building our networks and, like myself, like you can always hop online and make some content as well. But even being able to just talk about different political issues with family, with friends, with neighbors, that's an opportunity for all of us to do our own little mini rides.
Yeah, and be clandestine, perhaps, behind the scenes as well. I mean, we all can't do your fabulous YouTube videos. I would have the camera looking at a completely different direction, and it would be horrible. Well, we have. I think what I would like to do is open up the open it up for questions from the audience. I think we have a really great conversation going, and why don't we keep that sensibility with some input from our audience. If you have a question for the panelists, we want to keep the dialogue going, so I'm going to ask you to keep it as succinct as possible.
I'll do my best. Thank you all for coming. When you're recontextualizing history in a format that can be easily understood, whether it's online subscribers, students, how do you accomplish this without fabricating some of the details? For an example, the poem, right? They take some artistic liberties to it. How do you accomplish this without losing the source details, but still being able to put that into a format people can easily digest?
Well, I think if we could answer that, I think, the history would be much more widely studied. I think that's sort of the big challenge that all historians and teachers face. So I don't have a kind of formula, but I think what's important is trying to immerse students or whoever's studying the subject in the time. So I think having them read primary sources, I think Kerry alluded to that, or for example, I have them do role plays where they actually pretend, they're patriots and loyalists and argue the debates as though they were living at that time. And I think that's a way to bring that time to life for them while being true to the reality of it.
For me, I'm trying to pull out different themes that were themes from the past, but are also themes that people relate to presently, and sort of describe past organizations with modern language. And like we were saying, in this case, the truth is even more interesting than the fiction, right? Because there were these secret networks that were they're spying and sending information, right? There was a community self-organizing group at play. It was about political resistance. So if you're speaking in those sort of modern day terms, you can make things very interesting by pulling out those points without needing to add your own details.
I mean, certainly you want to tell a good story. That's what hooks people in learning the history. And the best teachers of history tell a good story, and the best writers about history tell a good story, right? The key is to do it in a way that is truthful, or to the best of your ability, truthful, and acknowledging where maybe there are gaps and things we don't know, and don't, fill that in. But I will also say that students really love some of the weird and gritty details of history as well. Certainly when you're learning about Paul Revere, the fact that he had 16 children is interesting to people today, right? That he also, like, on the side, practiced dentistry in his metal shop. That's interesting. So finding and highlighting those, like, you don't need to make those up. There's all sorts of weird stuff about history. Like, bring that to the surface too.
I mean, just even how people lived back then is so foreign to how we live today, that you just introducing that causes people to be like, oh, really? I think the other thing is, with your question, you're talking to people who are very dedicated to the historical method, so we're biased. So we're always rooted, everyone on this panel is rooted in historical methodology, and we're like, ooh, primary source, give it to me. We're not artists or poets who will perhaps want to stretch the truth or make it work for our imagination. Everybody on this panel is someone who's really dedicated to the accuracy and making sure that you're providing the details. And quite frankly, if you gave us a record group or a collections group that had been undiscovered in somebody's collections, like say here at Suffolk for the last 200 years, we would all go ham and have a fabulous time. That is not what normal people do. Let's just call a spade, right? So you kind of have a bias with the group of people up here today, because we really love historical methodology. Thank you so much for that question. Do we have another question?
I have a question from the live stream audience. So this one came in a little bit earlier in the panel, so I think that it has been partially answered, but I'll ask it anyway. You've spoken a lot, all of you, about the myth of kind of a individual action or individualism, this lone rider, as opposed to the reality, which was more complicated, more of a network. And so this commenter is asking, can you speak more to some of the other myths that have come up, either about the Midnight Ride or about Paul Revere?
Well, there's one big myth, which is that he said the British are coming.
Yeah.
And Fisher points out he wouldn't have said that because all of the revolutionaries still thought of themselves as British. So they would have said something like the regulars are coming. So I think that shows how actually again, that the revolutionaries and their opponents had more in common than is commonly realized.
There's also the myth from the poem, the poem that he was looking for the lanterns. But that was a signal that Paul Revere himself came up with so that the message would be transmitted across the river, even if he himself was apprehended. So that was like another invention that he added to this story, as opposed to waiting for the light signal. He was part of sending it.
It's not really part of a myth, but it's definitely not kind of the headline of any Paul Revere story that, you know, he himself is the son of an immigrant, and like many people who came after him, like the name was changed to sound more American. And it's just a really interesting part of the story, I think, that's maybe underexplored more than a myth, I would say.
Yeah, I think we had 2 questions. I think there's,
So I thought it was interesting earlier when we were talking about myth-busting being very popular in the culture right now, because I think something we do see at the Paul Revere House Museum, where I work, is that there are some people who come in really wanting to apply this myth-busting logic to Paul Revere. You know, I hear a lot of like, Paul Revere didn't actually even do the midnight ride. I hear a lot of like, Paul Revere probably just did that because he was cheating on his wife. You know, like people come up with all kinds of these like very myth-busting stories. And I'm interested, is that a thing that you see from your audiences? And if so, where do you feel like it comes from and how do you respond to it?
it's a good question. Thank you.
I saw a little of it with my class. I had one student who said something along those lines, where it was a kind of reversal of the whole myth from, you know, Revere's this hugely important figure to, you know, he didn't do anything at all. And as to where it comes from, I think that's a harder question to answer. And I think that's one of the dangers of taking apart these myths, that I think it has this tendency to kind of lead just to kind of a reversal of, you know, turning all the heroes into villains and the villains into heroes. And I think that's the challenge of history, is how do you take apart the myths without just turning everything around.
I work with a biased audience in that I teach in Lexington. We really like Paul Revere a lot.
Just a little bit, and then the day after, something small happened there, right?
So there's not a lot of specific myth busting about Paul Revere that takes place. I think people actually just want each other to learn the most complete version of the story that they can, rather than tear him down.
Yeah, with my audience, I think there's a lot of skepticism in general of histories that have been passed down to us that are clearly from a dominant perspective that has been messaged as the only perspective, but it's obviously not. And so there's just a lot of skepticism, a lot of questioning, which is why, to what I mentioned earlier, as you're trying to deconstruct things and disprove, you have to construct new narratives as well. So saying it might not be what you've heard, but trying to, again, not have a situation where just everything comes sort of crumbling down, but trying to present the new while you're dismantling the old.
Thank you. The young lady with the brown hoodie on.
Hi, I just wanted to say, as my classmate, thank you so much for coming as well. But you touched on this a little bit, but how do you get kids from engaged not from New England? Because I'm from Washington State, and I didn't really hear that much about Paul Revere until like my AP class in high school. So how do you get more like middle schoolers and elementary schoolers to get taught this more? Like you touched on this a little, but how do you get them like really engaged or wanting to learn about it all the way across the country?
I would say there's always a need for quality, free, open source materials. National Endowment for Humanities has produced many of them over the years. It's currently an institution that's quite threatened, unfortunately. But that is like the teacher's friend in presenting history. A lot of our museums produce really wonderful materials for teachers, but teachers need to be trained in where they are and how to use them. They need to be, at any opportunity, taken out to see the sites that they're about. Again, back to the National Endowment for Humanities, they've been running summer programs. I've done many of them over the years for decades that bring teachers from all over the country to learn about history that's maybe not their local history. This past summer, I went out through one of their programs to Little Tokyo, which is a neighborhood of LA, and learned about Japanese American immigration history. And we also went out to the desert and went to Manzanar. And you know, I will never not make that a part of my class when I'm teaching American history in the future, you know, for sure. So I think getting some of those teachers actually from Washington State out to see these places so they're not just, you know, a picture in a book, and they can bring those stories and experiences back to their students is a great way to do it. And we need to make sure that, you know, teaching history and social studies is really a non-negotiable in our classrooms, that it's happening in every grade for a set amount of time. It's an expectation. It's being monitored, not necessarily through tests. That's not the only way to monitor things, right? That's, you know, I think our state and local boards of education need to be paying a whole lot more attention to that.
Anyone else? We got a question back there and then over here.
Yeah, hi, thanks. So my question was about like the current environment because, look, I'm gonna put this on the record. I'm a libertarian. I'm not part of either party before I say this, but recently there was a picture of an enslaved man from Louisiana. It's a pretty famous picture put out by the Smithsonian. It's his back after he was whipped by the slave owners. So it got censored by, you know, whatever, it got censored. And there's something about this country which is really great, is like this country, unlike a lot of other countries, you admit what happened in history. Even in Germany, like after the Second World War, they admitted what happened, but like Russia, after the First World War, like many people still don't know it, but like they did surrender to Germany after the First World War. So how do you think like that the current environment is really affecting that?
I mean, aside from politics, it's always a mistake to hide the past or hide the truth, for sure, and that just needs to be accepted, for sure. I mean, there's no nation under the sun that doesn't have a complex history, and to try and erase the bad parts of that is a terrible mistake. You know, I would hope that's not an unusual view, but that is certainly my view.
I also think that it's a back and forth between like, are we admitting the mistakes in the past or not? So, you know, part of the question is like, America admits its mistakes. Sometimes, like some factions do more than others. And so I think this is a time where a more sort of revisionist faction is gaining more dominance. And there's always been that, you know, the lost cause and war of northern aggression and, you know, all those counter narratives. So there's always a flip side of the story. I wouldn't say it's always like straightforward as to what's being recognized as true and what isn't.
But I think that climate does create challenges because, and this gets back to the issue of regional difference, where I think in some states, you know, especially, you know, when you're looking at sort of below the college level, you know, whatever states are deciding is allowed to be taught in schools can affect what students are learning. And so I think that is something that is a challenge that a lot of teachers are facing right now.
I think we had questions over here.
You guys mentioned the shift in the focus on English and math and a lot in schools, and as someone who was like going through like grade school at the time, like I, you know, even subconsciously or whatever, noticed it too. And so I guess my question is, how likely do you think it is that there will be able to do like some revamping of the whole, like, you know, the way that history is taught in schools, and what like people, whether it's like, you know, teachers or students or whatever, can do to kind of like push for that shift back, I guess? Yeah,
it's interesting. So that has been the policy direction through political leaders of both parties, honestly, over the last 20 years, right, for sure. But there has been some pushback. So in Massachusetts in 2018, we did get new and updated and I think significantly improved history and social studies frameworks, right? And then later that same year, a law was passed through the Massachusetts legislature mandating that all middle schoolers and all high schoolers learn U.S. history and civics, and that they engage in an action civics experience both in middle school and in high school. So it was really our Mass legislator taking a stand that, we know this is the direction that things have been going on, kind of diminishing emphasis on history and social studies, but actually we want the opposite of that. And I honestly would like to see more of that. I think I also would caution that I don't think we're in a time of educational high-stakes testing, kind of driving the train. I don't want to see the requirement for history and social studies be enforced by more and more testing. I just want to see the requirement be that it's taught, that it's on kids' schedules, and that teachers are properly provisioned and supported in teaching it well.
How great would it be if kids could do like a National History Day type
National History Day is the best.
That would be an evaluation for them instead of like an exam.
That would be absolutely far preferable to an exam in my book, for sure. And really also give students some freedom and flexibility to pick a topic that they're personally interested in and really do a deep dive in researching it and sharing it with others, which is a great way to learn.
I think we had two
Yeah,
more.
we have a couple more from the live stream.
Oh yeah, let's I'm sorry, live stream. Let's go to the live stream.
Yeah, so these two are, I think, related to each other, so I'm going to present them together, and then we can go back to more folks in the room. So one question is, how do you differentiate fact-based historical accounts from modern political framing while keeping it interesting and relevant to current times? And then the question that feels a little bit like the flip side of it, please speak about the erosion of history and storytelling when state and federal governments try to restrict what facts can be taught.
Yeah, I guess we've sort of started touching on that already. And I think those are hard questions. I think the first question in terms of how do you differentiate kind of from kind of political framing. I think, and this goes back to what Noelle was saying about the historical method. I think a lot of the historical method is critical analysis, looking at lots of different sources and testing them against one another and trying to find patterns. So if you find, one source says one thing, but every other source says something else, then that one lone source is suspect. And so that's, I think, a lot of what history teachers are trying to teach their students. And I think that's the best way to teach the students, to decide for themselves what's real and what's political.
I think, too, I'd like to see, so our Massachusetts State Frameworks, as of the 2018 version, basically they've got two things in them. They've got content standards, which are a list of topics that teachers are supposed to teach about and students are supposed to learn about. Doesn't say the particular viewpoint they're supposed to hold on these. It's just a list of topics they should learn about and you should teach about. And it also has a set of skills, the practice standards, that you are to develop through the teaching and learning of history and social studies. And that's where I'd like to see our educational authorities land much more on, here's the topics and content that we are to make sure students have exposure to. And here's the skills that we want them to develop in their writing, in their critical thinking, in their evaluating of sources, right, in making an argument and substantiating it, right, then, really seeing government meddling around with the particular viewpoint a student or a teacher is supposed to take.
Yeah, speaking a bit towards the first question, I think there's a balance between describing sort of perennial political struggles in modern language and doing that to make things relate to modern audiences, and then giving the context of what was known at the time and what were the political parties at the time, what were they fighting for, what were their platforms, what knowledge, was known at the time, because knowledge evolves, and so some things that are obvious to us today weren't obvious then. So it's a balance of context and then making things relatable.
I'll just add to that. I think what we have seen in academic history that has now translated to public history is a reflection of the perspectives of the communities that existed in the time, right? There's just been a lot more scholars to look at, okay, if this is Paul Revere's ride, what was the Black community experience in Boston? And presenting that. It doesn't take away to the significance of the ride, it just enriches the picture, right? And so we see a lot more of that. And that is what's being challenged right now. It's not any of the work is being inaccurate. It is really that people have taken and enhanced the image that we have to a degree that it's essentially in high def now, and that's what we risk losing in this particular moment. I think we had, you want to go back to questions? We had some questions back here. Still have questions? Change your mind?
No, we have a question right there.
Thank you. So I'm going to kind of bounce off of a previous question of, I'm also not from Massachusetts. I'm from Indiana. And coming into this, I had like no context on him, like other than one picture book I read when I was like 7. And so, especially compared to like kids in Massachusetts who had that like location relevancy, how can like we tie the Midnight Ride back and like Paul Revere back into something that like all kids nationwide can kind of associate with?
It's a great question. Thank you so much. Did she stump you?
She did. I'm thinking, I mean, it's true. I mean, more than, or maybe half of the students across this country live in states that, were not yet part of the United States at the time of the American Revolution. Yeah. So making the Revolutionary era seem interesting and relevant, I think that's a really great challenge, right? I think maybe you kind of address that head on with students, all right? Why is this relevant, right, to us here in Indiana or us here in Colorado or to us here in Washington State, for sure. And, you should learn about the history as part of that, but I think kind of having students kind of think about the relevancy too, and then seizing other opportunities, right? Because, the Revolutionary era is not the only thing we study in history, where the local history, is more can lead the show in certain other places, in other topics too, and, making sure that happens across the country.
So I'll add, I've been on some of the national commission meetings around the 250th, where you have commissions from all the states who are doing commissions come together. It's usually about 30-something states. And you see a very big difference between the original 13 colonies versus the people who are out west. And as we were talking way back in like 2017, 2018, as early as then, the conversation among the western states was, how does it relate? Because our audience really isn't going to care. It's great if you're in Pennsylvania and you can visit Valley Forge, but how do I care? How do I get somebody in Iowa or Utah to care as passionately or invest in what's going to be this 250th moment? And there were a lot of questions. I don't feel like we ever really landed on a clear answer, so that's a non-answer for you. But it was a keen debate, and states out west have made very distinct decisions on how they're going to celebrate versus how they celebrate out here on the East Coast. I still tell people, thank Massachusetts, you're welcome, America. We started this thing for you, even though Pennsylvania wants to dispute us. But I think that's part of what we're seeing is that, I don't know, I think we're going to see in the next year what people are doing to make all the 250th moments feel real and significant and special in every state in the country. Other observations? We have another question?
Thank you. I just want to touch upon COVID and how that affected the younger generation, because I know that us college students, we learned about Paul Revere. We're actually from Revere, so
that's fantastic.
Coincidence.
Yeah.
So we definitely learned about him.
I'd have questions if you didn't.
Exactly. So how do you think it affected the curriculum for them, and how do you think it could how can we fix that?
Yeah.
Kerry, that sounds like a you question.
Yeah, it's a really good question, actually. So my 2 children are 18 and 20, and they really hit that COVID time period at the same time that probably you did, right? For sure. you know, I guess I always hear, you know, online learning did work great for somebody, but it didn't work really great for my kids, right? You know, I mean, I guess if you've got like a little professor who can teach themselves or something, but it was a poor fit for my two children, and it saddens me because, you know, this was in the early days of where we would have had 8th grade civics, and, you know, my kid was an 8th grader, like, didn't really get it at all, and missed out on that experience. So I think, you know, for high school teachers, for college students, for college professors, they've got to just really recognize that there are going to be some gaps in student learning and not make people embarrassed about that. And, you know, and I think it's a good practice anyways. Like, for example, when I asked about Paul Revere and where kids are learning, and when I had 4 kids in my class, I'm like, we just moved here this year to the United States. I'm like, who is this guy? I'm like, oh, well, let's take a minute and talk about it, you know? So I think it's a good method of instruction anyways to, you know, not be judgmental, right? Make students comfortable sharing that they didn't learn something or they need to know more, whether it's because of COVID or because they just got here, right? You know, we're not in a math class, you know, where, you know, you really can't learn C unless you learned A and B. You know, we can do multiple things at the same time, you know, and that's okay. But I think that's a great question for anyone teaching, right? They're teaching students who had pretty substantial gaps in what they would have learned for a year or more. And then when kids return to school, you know, student-to-student discourse was really limited for quite some time as well, and that's often the best way to process content and learn and engage with others. So it wasn't just a one-year phenomenon. I would say it was about 1 year and then a trailing 2-year impact would be more accurate for most students.
We have one more question.
Hi, thank you guys for coming out tonight. I'm sorry if at this point this might be repetitive or answered in various
Just ask
fragments.
a question. We're excited to have you ask.
Thank you. Earlier, you guys touched upon bridging constituencies in such a polarized America. So how today can we fuel history outside of the classroom to engage various citizens and demographics to stay involved as far as interpreting this, not only this era, but history in general, so that we can refresh and comprehend former documents to understand the American identity?
Great question. Thank you for asking. Mm-hmm. Eileen, you want to jump in on that one?
It's a challenging one, yeah, because I think, yeah, how to get people interested in this outside the classroom is hard. I mean, Hamilton was great when it came out, because I think it did that. Mm-hmm. So I guess maybe, you know, if more could be done, not, you know, just copying Hamilton, but finding creative ways of doing what Hamilton did, which was to bring these people to life by making them human. Mm-hmm. And also to show how the issues that the people were dealing with at the time of the Revolution are still relevant today. And maybe to do it in a creative, fun medium. And find other ways of achieving the same goals that Hamilton did. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and part of what I'm trying to do is tie things to current political challenges and our modern day political scene. So in the political history, economic history, political commentary space, I think pulling in more of those historical learnings and making them relevant to today's struggles, because people definitely care about politics today. So it's like, all right, I see this headline, I see this trending, how can I find an echo of that in the past and bring that to your attention so that we can learn from that?
One thing that a lot of our historic sites and partners here in Boston have done that is great, and I think it's the right direction. I've seen our National Park Service sites in Boston do this, and certainly Paul Revere House, Old North Church, many other of our really high-profile historic sites, is that they're constantly kind of learning more and unveiling new pieces to history, right? And that's exciting. It keeps things fresh. It's opportunities to bring in new voices, new constituencies. That's the right way to go about things, rather than just always relying on like the same tried and true, for sure. And like whenever possible, bringing young people on board with that process too, as researchers, developers, presenters of history, I think is really good.
Yeah.
Yeah, we want to lift up Paul Revere House for all the great work that they have done to keep the story of Paul Revere innovative and compelling, and did a wonderful program in April as well for the send-off that I think just made people see him differently. It is a challenge for museums and public historians to do the work, but that's what makes the work interesting. I find that I like to add, like you, Ahsante, I like to look at the parallels and be like, well, imagine someone saying this, and people are like, oh, you're talking about today. I'm like, no. This is like 1800 something. This is like 1775. Where is your mind? Oh my goodness. And then people realize that there's a lot more similarities between past and present. We're not so different. I think we have time. What do you think, Tegan? For one more? Or you
Sure,
you have an online question?
Yes.
So two more. We'll do an online and we got it in person.
Great. So from the live stream, we have someone asking, what is the value of teaching and learning about individual figures versus larger group-based movements? And is the study of individuals still valid, or has it been overexplored?
Oh, I think both are very valid, for sure. I think it's a problem to only teach the individual figures without the broader context or social movements, for sure, right? Maybe that has happened to a fault in the past, for sure, but there's still a place for exploring individual figures and learning how complex they were as individuals and what shaped their own identity. I think both remain really important.
Yeah, I would agree. It's a balance for me. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's not. I think the problem is not that there's been a focus on individuals, but it's how those individuals have been taught in our culture. That I think they've been just too glorified, and I think this relates back to the earlier question. I think they've become so glorified, these people like Revere or the founding fathers, that they've become just sort of abstract figures that students don't relate to. And I've had students say, yeah, that they're just like statues to us. So actually, I think showing their complexity, showing their flaws, showing that they were human would actually help make those figures more interesting and relevant to people today.
Showing the social context and the political context helps you to understand what those individual motivations are much more clearly than just having them as isolated figures too. So that's part of what the balance can do for that narrative.
I think broadening the spectrum of figures we look at or students have the opportunity to research is interesting too. When we teach about the civil rights movement, there's just like almost limitless individuals that we can study from all different backgrounds and all different places around this country. So let students have at it. And not just, the same two names from year to year to year. Not that we can't do those two, but still, I think like really broadening the range is a good idea.
So we have time for one more question. You, sir.
It's really a suggestion. You were talking about how to get people in Washington State, for example. I went to school in North Carolina, and we certainly learned about Paul Revere. But I think the thing is to focus on the people and to focus on, and it's not just the American Revolution, it's all of history. These are the most fantastic stories that ever existed. If somebody went to Hollywood and proposed a story about a bunch of, bankers, lawyers, farmers, laborers, all sorts of people taking on and successfully defeating the military superpower of the era, the script would be turned down as so implausible that nobody would believe it. But nobody told the people who did it. Those were people just like us. And, if I was actually over there on the Common on Saturday, and, I think one of the problems you have today is a lot of people don't realize that the people who built the country, for better or worse, were people just like them. And, don't seem to show up for a lot of things. Anyway, but that I think focusing on the people and the fact that they were humans really makes it relevant to everyday people.
Thank you so much for that. So who cares about the midnight ride? Well, everyone should. We want to thank the Paul Revere House, our wonderful panelists for this evening, our audience here at Suffolk University in the Commons, as well as all of you on live stream. Thank you so much for joining us. Please join us next week for the last one in the series, right? So thank you so much and have a wonderful evening.